The quiet city of Linyi, Shandong, was like any other during the National Day holiday. The streets hummed with a gentle, unspoken peace as families gathered, festival lanterns fluttering in the autumn breeze. The city felt suspended in a moment of calm. But somewhere, in the hidden corners of one family's life, there was a storm waiting to break. In this peaceful setting, an unexpected phone call was about to disrupt everything, setting into motion a series of events that no one could have foreseen. A brother, worried by the silence of his sister-in-law, would soon step into a nightmare, and the tranquility of the city would shatter irreparably. New Ngoc Kiet had always trusted his instincts, and that afternoon, they were screaming at him. His brother, New Ngoc Lin, had been out of town for several days, and Kiet had tried reaching out to his wife, Lưu Như Tuệ, without success. Concerned, he made his way to her home, expecting to find her caught up in the holiday festivities. But something in the air felt wrong, the familiar weight of unease sinking in as he approached the house. When he knocked, no one answered. His knock echoed in the empty hallway, but as his eyes drifted across the front door, he noticed something that froze him in place: a faint streak of blood across the door handle. The feeling of dread intensified. He knew, in that moment, something was terribly wrong. Kiet's breath caught in his throat. The blood wasn't just a small drip, it was a clear, deliberate streak. His hand trembled as he reached for his phone, dialing the police with shaking fingers. The silence of the house pressed in on him, and within moments, the tension seemed unbearable. When the officers arrived, they too felt it, the oppressive silence that held the house in a vice-like grip. As they forced open the door, a sharp, metallic scent filled the air, the unmistakable scent of blood. It flooded the space like a wave, and the chaos of the living room became all too clear: overturned furniture, shattered glass, and the unmistakable signs of a violent struggle. As the officers pushed deeper into the house, the feeling of something malignant, something utterly wrong, grew stronger. The hallway stretched dark and endless before them, like an abyss that promised only sorrow. In the back bedroom, they found the first of the bodies. Lưu Như Tuě's 7-year-old daughter, Nhữ Tố Giang, had been hidden in a narrow gap between the bed and wardrobe. She was small, lifeless, and tucked away in a space far too confined for someone so young. The chilling reality of the crime hit the officers hard. This wasn't just a missing persons case, it was far worse. It was a double murder, and the act that had taken place here was nothing short of monstrous. The discovery of the child's body pushed the investigation into a new, urgent direction. What had once seemed like an ordinary family home now stood as the site of an unimaginable tragedy. The sense of betrayal was thick in the air as the police began to search the house more thoroughly. The motive behind this brutal act remained a mystery. Missing valuables, disarrayed rooms, and a house meticulously searched for something. The killer had been looking for something. But what? Was it a robbery gone wrong, or was there something more sinister beneath the surface? The forensic team worked tirelessly, examining every piece of evidence, but with each passing moment, the case grew darker. As the night wore on, forensic experts began uncovering details that suggested this crime was more calculated than anyone had realized. Lưu Như Tuě's life was under scrutiny, and a disturbing pattern began to emerge. Missing valuables, signs of tampered gas pipes, and other oddities suggested that this wasn't just a random act of violence. Someone had planned this meticulously, and the intention wasn't just murder, it was destruction. The forensic team pieced together that the house had been searched thoroughly, perhaps looking for something specific. The evidence was stacking up, and with it, the chilling realization that this wasn't an ordinary murder at all, it was a calculated and deliberate act. The next discovery was something even more perplexing. A bottle of cheap liquor sat on the coffee table, half empty, with 2 glasses placed beside it. The scene suggested a conversation, perhaps even a drink between friends. But who had New Tuesday been entertaining? Why had she been drinking with someone in the hours before her death? The police were left with an unsettling question: what kind of relationship had she shared with the person who had been there that night? As the investigators worked through the night, the trail of evidence grew more tangled. A key lead came from New Tuesday's phone records. It seemed she had been in regular contact with a man named Tan Jung-de. The two had exchanged numerous calls, sometimes late into the night. On the surface, their relationship appeared innocent, perhaps a friendship, but as the police delved deeper into the records, it became clear that there was more to their connection than met the eye. What role had Tan played in this? And could he be the key to unraveling the mystery of the murders? Tan Jung-de was one of the last people to speak to New Tuesday before her death. Yet, when questioned, he denied knowing anything about the murders. His alibi seemed shaky, and his interactions with New Tuesday were far too frequent to be purely platonic. The investigators could sense that something was being hidden, and Tan's reluctance to cooperate only deepened their suspicions. Could he be involved in this crime, or was he simply another pawn in a much darker game? The twist came when Tan Jung-de finally broke down under the mounting pressure. He confessed to his involvement in the murders, but as his story unraveled, the investigation uncovered a far more complex truth. His relationship with New Tuesday had started innocently, but greed had quickly taken over. His desire for wealth had driven him to participate in something far darker than he could have ever imagined. Tan's confession sent shockwaves through the investigation. What had once seemed like a crime of passion, fueled by love or jealousy, now appeared to be the work of a cold, calculated plot. The involvement of money and the greed that had motivated the crime became evident. But the real question now was, who had pushed Tan to this? Was he the mastermind, or was there someone else behind the scenes pulling the strings? The investigation didn't end with Tan's confession. As the police dug deeper, they uncovered a complex web of deceit. Vuong Ding Quang, a man with a criminal past, had been Tan's accomplice. The two men had planned the murder together, and their actions were driven by a desire for wealth and power. The deeper the police dug, the clearer it became that this wasn't just a random act of violence, it was a deliberate and calculated plot, orchestrated by two men whose greed blinded them to the consequences of their actions. As the investigation progressed, the police continued to comb through the house. Every room, every object seemed to hold a clue, every corner whispered a piece of the grim puzzle. The living room had already told its tale of violence, but now, the darkness within the house deepened. The search revealed a disturbing pattern: bloodstains leading toward the back of the house. The trail seemed deliberate, as though someone had made sure to cover their tracks, trying to erase the true nature of the crime. The officers were no longer just dealing with a missing person, they were facing something far more sinister. The hallway was eerily silent as the officers ventured further into the home, each step weighed down by the looming uncertainty. The blood, still fresh in some places, painted a trail that led them toward the back bedroom. But the silence felt wrong. There was no comforting hum of life, no mundane sounds of a family home. The officers hesitated, knowing that what awaited them in the back bedroom would shatter everything they thought they knew about this crime. They opened the door, and the sight that greeted them was enough to steal the breath from their lungs. There, in the dim light, the officers found her New Tuesday. Her body, cold and lifeless, was positioned in an unnatural way, as though it had been placed with care in the shadows of the room. The brutality of the attack was clear from the deep trauma her body had sustained. Her once peaceful home had become a brutal crime scene, and the chilling nature of the murder set the tone for what the officers would find next. The sense of dread that hung in the air made it hard for anyone to breathe. This was no accident, it was a calculated, ruthless act. But as the officers carefully examined the scene, the horror deepened. In the narrow gap between the bed and wardrobe, hidden from sight, they found the small body of Nhữ Tố Giang. The 7-year-old had been brutally attacked, her tiny frame crushed by the same violent force that had taken her mother's life. The incongruity of it all, the violence against a child, left the investigators speechless. They had expected a family tragedy, but not this. The horror of the crime seeped into every corner of the room. How could anyone commit such an act of brutality against an innocent child? The scene was a puzzle, each new discovery adding to the weight of the tragedy. As the forensic team examined the room, they noted the meticulousness with which the bodies had been concealed. The killers had taken great care in positioning the bodies, but no amount of planning could cover up the sheer violence that had been inflicted. The officers continued to search the house, knowing that the answers to the questions that plagued them lay somewhere within these walls. But what were they truly searching for? Was it just revenge, or was there something else that had motivated such brutality? The house, once a place of love and safety, now felt like a tomb. As the investigation stretched into the night, new revelations began to surface. The house had been methodically searched. Valuable items, including jewelry and documents, were missing. Yet, the house was not merely ransacked, it had been violated. Signs of tampered gas pipes suggested that the killer had intended to do more than just steal. Had this been an attempt to destroy the evidence, or was it something more? The presence of the missing valuables hinted at a deeper motive: greed. The investigators quickly realized that the brutal attack was not just about anger or jealousy, it was something far more calculated. Missing valuables, tampered gas pipes, and the careful searching of the house suggested that the killer had been looking for something specific. The fact that the gas hadn't detonated indicated that the killer had been hasty in their plans. Was this a robbery gone wrong, or was there a deeper motive at play? The police needed to know, what was the killer truly after, and why had they left so much destruction in their wake? It became clear that the killer had known exactly what they were doing. The lack of forced entry suggested that the victims knew their attacker. This wasn't just a random act of violence, it was personal. The police began to shift their focus to the people in New Tuesday's life who had been close enough to gain access to her home, to her family, and to the wealth she had guarded so fiercely. The answers weren't easy to find, but the connection between New Tuesday and a mysterious man named Tanjung would soon become a key piece of the puzzle. Tanjung had been a constant presence in New Tuesday's life, or so it seemed. The police discovered phone records that revealed the frequency and late-night nature of their calls. At first, the investigators dismissed him as nothing more than a friend. But as they dug deeper, it became apparent that there was more to their relationship than anyone had imagined. The question now was he simply a bystander in this tragedy, or was he an integral part of the puzzle that had led to the deaths of New Tuesday and her daughter? When questioned, Tan denied any involvement in the crime. His alibi seemed weak, and his reluctance to cooperate raised more questions than answers. His denials were convincing at first, but the evidence told a different story. the police were beginning to piece together a more disturbing picture, one that painted Tan as more than just a friend. Had he been involved in something far more sinister than a casual affair? The investigators pressed harder, sensing that Tan knew more than he was letting on. Finally, under the weight of relentless questioning, Tan cracked. The confession that followed was chilling. He admitted to knowing Lu New Tuesday, but what he revealed next sent shockwaves through the investigation. Their relationship had started as a friendship, but it had quickly morphed into something far darker. Tan confessed that he had been involved in the murders, but he insisted that he had been manipulated. Who, then, had pushed him to this point? Was he just a pawn in a much larger, more complex scheme? Tan's confession was the key to unlocking the entire case. As the police delved deeper into his involvement, they discovered that he wasn't the mastermind. He had been manipulated by Vuongding Quang, an accomplice with a dark past. Quang had used Tan's desperation to his advantage, convincing him that the murder of Lu New Tuesday would solve his financial struggles. The greed that had clouded Tan's judgment had now become the driving force behind a chilling crime. In the wake of the brutal murders, the investigation moved from the crime scene to the social circles of Lu New Tuesday. On the surface, she had lived a quiet suburban life, surrounded by the humdrum of everyday routines. But as the investigators dug deeper, they began to uncover disturbing details about her hidden life. The phone records painted a different picture: a series of late-night calls, long conversations, and one name that kept coming up, Tan Chungda. Initially, their interactions seemed innocent enough, but as more was revealed, the investigators wondered if Lu New Tuesday had been leading a double life. The investigators' search through Lu New Tuesday's phone and personal belongings revealed something unsettling. The affair with Tan had not been as innocent as it appeared. For months, the two had been involved in a relationship far more intimate than anyone had imagined. Why had she kept the secret from her family, and why had Tan been the only one she confided in? As the police pieced together the timeline of their interactions, it became clear that there was more to this than just a simple affair. It was a relationship that had woven itself into the very fabric of the tragedy that unfolded. Tan's denials during the initial interrogation were expected. He had tried to distance himself from the crime, insisting that his relationship with Lu New Tuesday was nothing more than a friendship. But the investigators were far from convinced. The sheer frequency and late-night nature of their calls left little room for doubt. This was something more than mere friendship. As the evidence mounted, the investigators grew more and more suspicious of Tan's role in the murders. Was he lying to protect himself, or was he genuinely unaware of the full extent of the plot? The investigation into Tan Chungda's background soon revealed a troubling truth. Tan wasn't just an innocent bystander. He had been living a double life, one that had involved more than just a secret love affair. As the investigators traced his financial dealings and past connections, they uncovered links to illegal activities and shady figures. Tan had been entangled in a web of deceit, and his connection to Lu New Tuesday was far more complicated than anyone had realized. But could this be enough to link him to the murders, or was there someone else in the shadows pulling the strings? The deeper the investigators delved into Tan's past, the clearer it became that greed had played a central role in this tragedy. Tan had been financially struggling, overwhelmed by debt, and desperate for a way out. It was at this vulnerable point that Vuongding Quang, with his criminal connections, had come into his life. Quang, a man with a history of theft and deceit, saw an opportunity in Tan's desperation. Through manipulation, he had convinced Tan that committing the murders would solve their financial problems. It was a lie that spiraled into a horrific act of violence. But Tan was not the only one with his hands dirty. Vuong Ding Quang had been the mastermind behind the plot, the one who had orchestrated the murder of Lưu Như Tuesday and her daughter. As the police continued to investigate, they discovered that Quang had carefully manipulated the entire situation, using Tan as a pawn in his scheme. Quang's financial troubles and his insatiable thirst for wealth had pushed him to the brink of insanity, and he had pulled Tan into his world of crime, convincing him that the murders were a means to an end. Vuong Ding Quang's role in the crime was not just about money, it was about control. As the investigation progressed, it became clear that Quang had used Tan's desperation and vulnerabilities to coerce him into carrying out the murders. Quang promised Tan that the financial gain would set them both free, but in reality, it was Quang's need for control that had fueled the entire plot. The power dynamics at play in this tragedy were chilling, and the more the police uncovered, the more they realized that this crime wasn't about a simple robbery, it was about domination and the insatiable greed that drove these men to destroy everything they had once trusted. The investigators continued to uncover disturbing truths about the relationship between Lưu Như Tuesday and her family. Her connection to Tan and Quang was just one layer of a much darker web of deceit. They began to find evidence that she had been involved in other questionable financial dealings, and that some of her closest friends had their own secrets to hide. As the investigation deepened, it became clear that Lưu Như Tuesday's seemingly perfect life had been built on lies and manipulations. But did this justify the horrific murder of a mother and child? It was becoming increasingly evident that Lưu Như Tuesday had been targeted not just for her wealth, but for the power that wealth represented. The missing valuables, the tampered gas pipes, and the stolen financial records all pointed toward a more calculated motive than a simple robbery. The police began to piece together a much darker picture, one in which the victims' lives were consumed by the very greed that had driven their killers. The more they discovered, the more they realized that the true nature of the crime was about to be revealed. As the police uncovered more about Quang's involvement, they found that he had not acted alone. His manipulations had extended beyond Tan. He had built a network of people around him, individuals who were equally complicit in the scheme. Some were aware of the murders, others merely pawns, but all had contributed to the unraveling of a family's life. Quang had positioned himself as the orchestrator, pulling strings and manipulating those around him to create a perfect storm of violence. But what was his endgame? What had he hoped to achieve, and what had he ultimately lost in the process? The more the investigators learned, the more they understood that the crime was not just a product of personal greed, it was a manifestation of the breakdown of trust, love, and family. Tan, manipulated by Quang, had been a victim in his own right. He had been fed lies and convinced that the murders were the only way to secure his future. Yet, as the full scope of the crime became clear, it was impossible to ignore the cold, calculating nature of the violence. What had driven these men to betray not just the victims, but everyone who had trusted them? The pieces of the puzzle were finally falling into place. As the investigation reached its climax, the investigators were able to connect Quang to a larger web of criminal activities, many of which were tied to the financial scheme that had led to the murders. It was clear now that greed had not just led to murder, it had consumed everything in its path. The pursuit of wealth had overshadowed every moral compass, every ounce of human decency, and the result was a family destroyed. Was this truly the price of greed? And who would pay for it? As the final pieces of evidence came together, the investigators began to understand just how deep the conspiracy had run. This wasn't just the work of one or two men, it was a network of people, all connected by a single force, greed. And as they pieced together the connections, they were faced with a chilling reality. What had started as a domestic betrayal had spiraled into a far larger tragedy, one that had forever altered the lives of those involved. The true cost of greed had revealed itself, and there was no going back. By the end of the investigation, the police had uncovered the full scope of the crime. Tan Chungde, Vuong Quang, and the others involved had all played their part in the destruction of an innocent family. But the real question was, how far were they willing to go? How much had their desire for wealth, control, and power clouded their judgment? As the investigation concluded, it became clear that the true cost of their actions would not just be measured in years of imprisonment, but in the lives they had destroyed. As the investigation shifted gears, the puzzle pieces slowly started to align. What had initially seemed like a crime driven by passion and jealousy was quickly unmasked as something much darker. Beneath the layers of deceit, the true motivation revealed itself, a ruthless desire for money and control. New Tuesday's wealth had not been just an afterthought, it had been the core of the tragedy that had unfolded. The missing valuables, the carefully executed tampering with the gas pipes, and the stolen financial documents all pointed in one direction. This was a calculated attack fueled by greed, not love. As the police continued their investigation, it became painfully clear, the murder wasn't a spontaneous act of rage. New Tuesday's wealth had been targeted from the beginning, and every move the perpetrators made was designed to strip her of everything she had. The financial records, once hidden away, now revealed a sinister trail of large, unexplained withdrawals. The missing bank cards, the tampered gas lines, and the rushed attempt to cover up the crime all pointed to a methodical, well-thought-out plan to take everything from her. The killer wasn't after just a quick kill, they wanted it all. It wasn't just the financial aspect that disturbed the investigators, it was the precision with which the crime had been carried out. The missing valuables weren't just signs of a robbery, they were clues that suggested the killers had been after something far more valuable than money. As the forensic team sifted through the evidence, they began to uncover even darker truths. The more they learned about the perpetrators, the more they realized that this was not just a crime driven by greed but by a twisted sense of entitlement and manipulation. The key to the case was not just the financial theft, it was the manipulation of the people involved. Lăng Thanh Quân, despite his initial denials, had been lured into the scheme by someone he trusted, Vuong Quang. Quang had fed Quan lies about the victim's wealth, promising him a share in the spoils if he helped execute the plan. Tan was initially hesitant, but the promise of financial freedom pushed him to make the ultimate betrayal. What started as a simple act of desperation had grown into something monstrous, something that would forever change the course of their lives. Vuong Quang's involvement in the crime was far deeper than anyone had realized. A man with a criminal past, Quang had never been a stranger to shady dealings. But what he had done in this case went beyond the usual financial scams. He had manipulated Quan's fears, his desperation for money, and turned those vulnerabilities into a weapon. Quang had played the role of the mastermind, pulling strings from the shadows, knowing exactly how to exploit the weakness of those around him. But why? What had driven him to orchestrate such a ruthless plot? Was it just the money, or was there something more? What was most chilling about Quang's role in the crime was not just his manipulation of Tan, but how he viewed the people involved in the murder. To him, New Tuesday and her daughter were mere obstacles, pawns in a game he believed he could control. The lives of innocent people had been sacrificed so that he could fulfill his twisted desire for power. It wasn't just about money, it was about the need to dominate, to claim control over someone else's life. For Quang, the murder had become a tool to reshape his future, but at what cost? The investigation soon uncovered that the crime was much more than just an act of greed. It was a well-planned and carefully executed scheme. The missing valuables, the tampered gas pipes, and the methodical search of the house all pointed toward a single conclusion: this had been a crime of opportunity, one that had been carefully orchestrated for maximum gain. The fact that the murder had been staged in such a way made it clear that the killer had thought of everything, leaving nothing to chance. This wasn't just a random act of violence, it was a calculated crime driven by the need to control and dominate. In their pursuit of answers, the police discovered even more chilling details about the perpetrators. Lăng Thanh Quân, while undoubtedly complicit in the murder, had been pushed to the edge by Vuong Dinh Quang's manipulations. Quan's desperation for money had clouded his judgment, but it was Quang's insatiable desire for power that had ultimately driven the crime. As the investigation unraveled, the investigators were left with a haunting question: was Quan simply a pawn in Quang's grand scheme, or had he become an active participant in his own destruction? As the investigation unfolded, it became increasingly clear that the crime wasn't just about money, it was about power. The killers had been motivated by a twisted desire to take control of the victims' lives, to manipulate them into a position where they could take what they wanted. Lưu Như Tuesday's life had been nothing more than a stepping stone to their goal, and in the end, her family had paid the price. The fact that her daughter, an innocent child, had been targeted in such a brutal way spoke volumes about the depths of depravity the perpetrators had sunk to. The more the investigators learned about Quang and his role in the crime, the more the sense of disgust grew. Quang had not only manipulated Tan and Quan, but he had carefully constructed a narrative to ensure that everything played out according to his design. It was a game for him, a game where the lives of innocent people were mere pawns. As the police connected the dots, it became clear that the true mastermind behind the murders wasn't just a criminal, it was a man who had twisted his own sense of morality to fit his desires. By the time the police had gathered enough evidence, the full scope of the crime had been revealed. The killers had thought they were clever, careful, calculated, and ready to take everything for themselves. But the more they had manipulated those around them, the deeper they had dug themselves into a hole. The investigation had begun to reveal not just the cold, ruthless crime they had committed, but the horrifying consequences of their actions. This wasn't just about murder, it was about the destruction of everything that had once been good in their lives. The tragedy of Lưu Như Tuesday and her daughter, Nhữ Tố Giang, would never be forgotten. Their lives had been taken by the very people they had trusted. Quang and Quan had stolen more than just money, they had stolen the future, the love, and the trust that once existed within the family. The investigation had uncovered the full extent of their crimes, but no amount of justice could ever undo the damage they had caused. The pain of loss would linger long after the trial ended. The investigation had reached its critical turning point. Evidence, phone records, and witness statements were all pointing toward Lăng Thanh Quân as the key figure behind the murders, yet despite the mounting pressure, he remained steadfast in his denials. The police had already pieced together a disturbing sequence of events, but what remained was the hardest part: getting Quan to admit the horrifying truth. No matter how strong the evidence, it was always the breaking point of a suspect's own conscience that brought the truth to light. The pressure was building, and it was only a matter of time before Quan's resolve cracked under the weight of his guilt. As the hours wore on in the interrogation room, Quan's facade of innocence began to crumble. The relentless questioning, the unyielding evidence stacked against him, it all began to take its toll. At first, he was defensive, insisting that he had nothing to do with the murders. But slowly, imperceptibly, the cracks began to appear in his story. And then, with a shuddering breath, Quan admitted what no one had expected him to say: he was involved in the deaths of Lưu Như Tuesday and her daughter, Nhữ Tố Giang. The confession came like a blow to the chest, and the room grew heavy with the weight of truth. Quan's confession was chilling in its calmness. He recounted the events leading up to the murders, explaining how greed and desperation had consumed him. What began as a promise for financial freedom from Vuong Dinh Quang had turned into a nightmare of regret. The details of his confession were methodical, calculated, but what struck the investigators most was the lack of remorse in his voice. There was no genuine sorrow for the lives he had taken, only a resigned acceptance of what he had done. It was clear now, this was not a crime of passion, but a crime born of cold, unrelenting greed. As Quan's words spilled out, he revealed more than just the murder. He detailed the meticulous planning that had gone into the crime, from the careful selection of the victim to the way the scene had been staged. He spoke of how Vuong Dinh Quang had used him as a pawn, promising him a future of wealth in exchange for his compliance. But Quan's confession also revealed something darker: the utter disregard for the lives he had taken. For Quan, it wasn't just about money, it was about control, about the power to manipulate and destroy. The confession grew more disturbing as Quan spoke of the premeditated steps he took to cover up the crime. He had carefully staged the scene to make it seem like a botched robbery, but nothing about the murder had been accidental. From tampering with the gas pipes to hiding the bodies, every move had been made to ensure that he and his accomplice, Quang, could get away with it. Quan's meticulous planning revealed the true horror of the crime. It wasn't just a moment of violence, it was a calculated act, an attempt to erase the evidence and cover up the murder. As the confession continued, Quan admitted something even more chilling: his motives had been clouded not just by greed, but by fear. Fear of losing the money, fear of facing the consequences of his actions. His desperation had blinded him to the humanity of the victims. The lives of Lưu Như Tuesday and her daughter had been nothing more than obstacles to him, obstacles that stood in the way of his chance at a better life. He had allowed his own fear and greed to justify the ultimate betrayal, the ultimate crime. The weight of Quan's confession hit the investigators hard. He had been lured by the promise of money, but what he had gained was far from what he had expected. In his mind, the murders were justified, necessary to solve his financial problems. But as his confession unraveled, it became clear that the consequences of his actions were far greater than he could have imagined. The lives of Lưu Như Tuesday and Nhữ Tố Giang could never be replaced, and the damage Quan had caused would haunt him for the rest of his life. What stood out most about Quan's confession was the sense of manipulation he described. Vuong Dinh Quang had used Quan's vulnerability to control him, promising him riches and a way out of his financial struggles. Quan's own desperation had led him to believe that this was the only way to escape his problems. But what Quan failed to realize was that the cost of his decision was far greater than any sum of money. The lives of two innocent people were lost, and his own future was ruined by his complicity in the murder. As Quan's confession became more detailed, the investigators realized just how deep Vuong Dinh Quang's involvement had been. Quang was not just an accomplice, he was the mastermind behind the entire plot. Quan had been manipulated from the start, but it was Quang who had orchestrated the crime, exploiting Quan's weaknesses and driving him to commit murder. As the police began to focus on Quang, the full scope of the crime came into view. What had begun as a simple financial scheme had spiraled into a tragedy of monumental proportions. Quan's confession finally tied everything together. It wasn't just about money, it was about control, power, and the lengths to which Vuong Dinh Quang had gone to achieve it. Quan, despite his own role in the crime, had been manipulated by someone far more dangerous. The investigators now had all the pieces they needed to bring Kwang to justice. But as the investigation reached its conclusion, one question remained: had Kwang been a willing participant in this plot, or had he been just another pawn in Kwang's game of greed and manipulation? The trial had begun, and the courtroom was thick with tension. Lăng Thanh Quân stood at the front, a man once filled with false hope, now facing the inevitable consequences of his actions. His life had been reduced to a series of poor decisions, all stemming from one undeniable truth: greed. As the prosecutor read out the charges, Kwan's cold expression betrayed no remorse. It was as though the weight of the lives he had destroyed had never truly sunk in. Yet the courtroom, filled with mourners and investigators alike, was painfully aware of the magnitude of his crime. The moment the judge's gavel struck, there was a stillness in the air, a moment of finality that echoed through the room. Lăng Thanh Quân, the man who had killed 2 innocent lives, was sentenced to death. The verdict was harsh, but just. There was no escape for him, no redemption from the cold truth of his greed. The lives of Lưu Tuesday and her daughter, Nhữ Tố Giang, could never be returned, and the sentence was a reminder that those who let greed guide their actions would eventually face the consequences. In contrast, Vuong Dinh Quang, the mastermind behind the plot, received a sentence of life imprisonment. Though he had not directly committed the murders, his role in manipulating Quan into carrying out the crime was undeniable. His sentence was a grim reminder that even those who orchestrate the destruction of others' lives must pay the price for their actions. Yet, despite the gravity of his punishment, Kwang's expression remained cold. The damage he had done both physically and emotionally could never be undone. The trial was over, but for Lưu Tuesday's family, the verdict was not enough. The pain of losing a loved one, the trauma of knowing that their family members had been betrayed and murdered by those they trusted, could not be erased by a legal judgment. Lưu Tuesday's sister, Lưu Nguyệt Hoa, sat in the courtroom, holding tightly to the photo of her lost sister. Her face was filled with sorrow, but also a quiet resolve. She would never forget what had been done to her family, and no sentence could undo the damage that had been inflicted upon them. For Lưu Tuesday's surviving child, Nhữ Ngoc Hoang, the emotional scars were even deeper. Though he had physically survived the brutal attack, the psychological damage would linger for the rest of his life. The loss of his mother and sister, the trauma of witnessing the violence, would shape his future in ways no one could predict. He would grow up without the warmth of family, without the love that should have surrounded him. His story, though one of survival, would be forever marked by the shadows of what had been stolen from him. As the trial ended and the guilty verdicts were delivered, the streets outside the courthouse fell eerily quiet. Justice had been served, but the cost was immeasurable. Lăng Thanh Quan's and Vuong Dinh Quang's lives were ruined, but the real cost of their actions could not be measured in years behind bars. The victims Lưu Tuesday, Nhữ Tố Giang, and the family members who had been left behind had paid the ultimate price. What had they gained? A temporary escape from financial hardship? A few moments of power? In the end, it was nothing but destruction. Greed had consumed Lăng Thanh Quân and Vuong Dinh Quang, turning them into monsters capable of unthinkable violence. Their actions had destroyed not just the victims, but their own humanity. When the desire for money overpowers the value of life, it leaves a trail of devastation in its wake. The money they had hoped to claim, the power they had sought to control, meant nothing now. Their lives were forever marked by the decisions they had made. And the families left behind would never be the same again. As the investigation drew to a close, it was impossible not to reflect on the human cost of greed. What was it that made Quan and Quang turn on their own families, betray their loved ones, and take innocent lives? The pursuit of money, the desire for power, these things, though temporary, had consumed them. They had chosen greed over love, and in the end, it had destroyed everything. As we look back on this case, we are left with the haunting question: how far are we willing to go for wealth, and at what cost? The trial may have been over, but the story was far from finished. The impact of the murders would ripple through the community for years to come. Lưu Như Tue's family, though they had won justice in the courtroom, would forever be haunted by the loss. For them, no amount of money, no legal victory, could bring back what they had lost. The true cost of greed wasn't just the lives it claimed, it was the years of pain, suffering, and brokenness it left behind. As we close this chapter of the case, we are reminded of a harsh truth: greed, when left unchecked, can destroy everything in its path. The choices that Quan and Quang made were driven by a hunger for wealth, but what they ultimately gained was far from what they had expected. Their lives were ruined, their humanity lost. And in the end, they were left with nothing but regret. The true price of greed had been paid, and the consequences were irreversible. The courtroom was silent as the final moments of the trial played out. The gavel echoed like the toll of a bell, marking the end of a long, painful journey. Lăng Thanh Quân, once a man driven by desperation and greed, now stood at the mercy of justice. His fate had been sealed by his own actions, yet it was clear that the devastation he had caused reached far beyond the courtroom walls. For the families of the victims, no verdict, no sentence could undo the damage. Justice was served, but the scars remained. Lăng Thanh Quan's expression was void of emotion as the death penalty was pronounced. The sentence, though harsh, seemed fitting given the gravity of his crime. He had destroyed 2 innocent lives, taken everything from a family, all for the pursuit of wealth. Yet, as he stood there in silence, it was clear that even death could not restore what had been lost. The years he would spend in prison were nothing more than a small price compared to the loss suffered by Lưu Như Tue's family. His regret, if he felt any, would never change the reality of the lives he had taken. Vuong Dinh Quang, despite not having killed anyone directly, had orchestrated the entire plot. His sentence, life imprisonment, seemed like a hollow victory. Though Quang had been the mastermind, he had yet to fully comprehend the enormity of his actions. Life behind bars would give him plenty of time to reflect, but would it ever be enough to atone for the family he had shattered? The guilt would follow him every day, and though he would never walk free again, his prison would be one of his own making, locked within his own conscience. The court had delivered its judgment, but for the families of the victims, the real punishment was the lifetime of grief they would carry. Lưu Như Tue's family, especially her sister, Lưu Nguyệt Hoa, had to come to terms with the devastating truth: their loved ones had been taken from them in the most horrific way imaginable. There was no justice that could undo the loss of a mother and a child. They would have to live with this pain forever. The verdict might have given them some closure, but it would never fill the emptiness left behind. For the youngest survivor, Ngu Ngoc Hoang, the journey to healing would be long. Though physically unharmed, his heart had been broken in ways that no one could see. The trauma he carried would follow him into adulthood. He would grow up without his mother's love, without his sister's laughter. But despite the pain, there was a flicker of hope. His relatives, the ones who stepped in to care for him, would offer him love and support. While the future was uncertain, the kindness of those around him could help him rebuild, piece by piece, the life that had been torn away. As the trial came to a close, the weight of the events that had unfolded settled heavily over the community. Justice had been served, but the cost was immeasurable. The echoes of the crime would be felt for years to come. Families and friends, while finding some semblance of peace in the legal proceedings, were left to rebuild shattered lives. Lưu Như Tuesday's family would never be the same. The loss of a loved one, the betrayal that led to her death, was something that no amount of legal justice could repair. The question remained, would the survivors ever truly heal? The case was a reminder that justice is not always black and white. No amount of punishment could replace the lives lost, and no legal system could undo the trauma left in its wake. The true cost of this crime, and of the greed that drove it, could not be measured in years of imprisonment or the death penalty. It was a reminder that the human cost of crime is far greater than any sentence. The pain of loss, of betrayal, and of broken trust would last far beyond the courtroom. As we reflect on this case, we are reminded of the fragility of life and the deep scars left by greed. Lăng Thanh Quân and Vuong Dinh Quang's actions, driven by their insatiable desire for money and control, shattered an innocent family. Their lives were forever altered by their choices, and the victims, too, would carry the weight of their actions. The true heroes of this story were the family members who, despite their unimaginable loss, would find the strength to move forward. In the face of betrayal and tragedy, they remained unbroken. As the final verdict was read, the courtroom fell silent. The price of greed had been paid, but it was a price that could never bring back the lives lost. This case would serve as a warning, a reminder of how the pursuit of wealth can corrupt, and how greed can blind even the most rational of people. It was also a reminder that, no matter how much money is stolen or how many lives are destroyed, the true cost of greed is the loss of humanity.